This video is sponsored by Incogni. Imagine this, the United States has hundreds of political parties. Not two, but hundreds. There are 4 presidents running the country, and one isn't even a person, but an entire state acting as a collective president. And every single state, from California all the way to Rhode Island, has the power to veto any major foreign policy decision, like Trump's order to bomb Iran. Sound chaotic? Well, that's basically what the United States would look like if it were run like the European Union. Now, don't worry, this is not a pitch to turn America into the United States of Europe. In fact, I strongly recommend not trying that. But this thought experiment is a fun way to understand how the EU actually works, and why Europe can feel so slow, so indecisive, and well, frustrating. Alright, to make this comparison work, we need to set some ground rules. In our little experiment, the 50 US states will act like the 27 EU countries, and the United States as a whole will represent the European Union. And we'll start with elections. How do Americans actually pick their leaders today? In the US federal system, there are lots of elections. Take someone living in New York. They'll vote for their members of Congress, meaning their representatives every 2 years and their senators every 6 years. And of course, they'll head back to the polls to vote for the president every 4 years. And to keep things simple, let's not get into other elections, like the presidential primaries. That's a whole other level of complexity. Now, if the US were to adopt an EU system, elections would actually simplify drastically. And trust me, that's probably the only time I'll use the word simplify in this entire video. In the EU, citizens only elect one institution directly, the European Parliament, every 5 years. So in our EU-style America, we'd replace all of these elections for the president, senators, and representatives with just one. Elections for the US Parliament. Yes, we are also giving US institutions European names too. And this is where it gets fun, because how the Parliament would get elected is very different. In Europe, every country has its own political parties. For example, in the Netherlands, you can pick from about 27 different parties, and those 27 parties are completely different from what people would vote for in, say, Germany or Spain. So if we copy that system, every US state would have its own parties too. No more only Republicans, no more only Democrats. Instead, a beautiful chaos of small local parties. People in New York would vote for their favorite state party, and those results would feed into our shiny new US Parliament, with seats handed out roughly in proportion to each state's population. That means over 200 different state parties in the US Parliament. Yes, 200, not 2. So to make that even remotely functional, these parties would have to bunch together into coalitions, usually between 6 and 8 big ones. You'd have everything from the far left to the far right, with centrists, Greens, libertarians, and probably a few make pineapple pizza great again movements in between. And then, all of these coalitions would have to work together, negotiating, compromising, and watering down their ideas until everyone's kind of happy, or at least equally annoyed. Okay, so what do we do about the Senate? Do we scratch that completely? No. The EU has something kind of similar, called the Council of the EU, but honestly, it's only similar at best. And this is where things start to get very complicated. Because in the Council, people aren't directly elected. Instead, it's made up of ministers from each member state. So if the topic is the environment, then all the environmental ministers from the 27 countries show up. If it's transport, then all of the transport ministers show up. And if it's finance, you guessed it, all the finance ministers. So, in our new US model, the Senate would be replaced with the Council of the US. Not 100 senators, but a fluid number of people, where each state sends whichever state secretary or commissioner handles that very topic up for debate. So when transport is discussed, 50 transport commissioners, one from each state, would turn up. Alright, now things get even more complicated, because well, it's the EU. The EU has one institution that doesn't really exist in the US. It's called the European Council. This brings together all the heads of state of government, basically the presidents and prime ministers of the 27 EU countries, and they decide the big picture direction of the European Union. So, in our US as the EU model, we'd have the American Council, made up of all 50 governors coming together to decide the overall direction that America should take on big ticket issues. And without their support, the president wouldn't have much power at all. Now, this brings us to the presidents. And yes, the EU has a staggering 4 of them. But before we get into that, a quick word from our sponsor. A few months ago, I got a call from a random German number. It looked legit. The guy claimed to be an Amazon representative, asking whether I wanted to extend or cancel my Prime subscription. Perfect timing, I thought. I barely use Prime anyway. And yes, you're probably calling me an idiot already, and you'd be right. My brain was deep in the middle of writing a YouTube script, and I simply wasn't thinking. He sounded super professional and said all I had to do was download a service app from the Play Store. So I searched it and actually found one. But thank God, just before hitting install, my brain finally switched back on, screaming scam. I cancelled the call, and after a bit of Googling, it turns out the app would have helped to compromise everything on my phone, including my banking details. And this wasn't the first time. Scam calls, phishing emails, sketchy links, they keep coming. Why? Because my personal data is out there, and yours is too. And for a long time, there was nothing you could do about it. Until now. Check out Incogni, a service that fights to get your personal information removed from data brokers. These companies are legally required to delete your data if you ask them, but doing that manually, that's a full-time job. Incogni does it all for you, automatically. They contact the brokers, request removals, and handle any objections, all on your behalf. It's super simple. Make an account, tell them what info you want removed, and give them permission to act for you. Then sit back and let Incogni do the work. So, if you want to take back control of your data, click the link below or go to incogni.com/EUMadeSimple to sign up and get an exclusive 60% off an annual plan. Back to the video and how the presidency would work in our new US model. In the EU, the most powerful executive figure is the President of the European Commission, currently Ursula von der Leyen. She leads the EU's executive branch, basically the team that proposes laws, manages policies, and tries to make sure everyone sticks to the same rules. In our new US model, this will be called the US Commission. And surprise, surprise, the president of the US Commission wouldn't be directly elected by the people either. Instead, our American Council, remember, that's all 50 governors, would pick a candidate behind closed doors. And then the US Parliament would have to vote to approve them with an absolute majority. So, that basically means no campaign rallies, no debates, no slogans. Just a lot of phone calls and late-night negotiations. And of course, the US Commission President wouldn't be the only president in this new system. That would be too simple. There would also be the American Council President, who represents all 50 governors and chairs their meetings. Then there'd be the US Parliament President, who oversees debates and votes inside the parliament and makes sure everyone more or less behaves. And finally, the Council of the US President, who isn't even a person, but a state. Yes, a state. Basically, one US state would get to hold the presidency of the council for 6 months, setting the agenda and deciding which topics are prioritized, before handing it all over to the next state. So one half of the year, it's Texas running the show, and the next is Vermont. What could possibly go wrong? So, that's our brand new US model. To summarize, the US Parliament is elected by citizens every 5 years, the Council of the US is made up of state commissioners, depending on the topic, the American Council brings together all 50 governors, and the US Commission President is chosen by the same 50 governors. Now, if that's not already confusing enough, let's see what happens when the system actually tries to make a law. Imagine President Trump decides he wants to finally impose sanctions on Russia. Under our new system, that proposal would have to go through both the US Parliament and the Council of the US. The Parliament would need an absolute majority for it to pass. Fair enough. But the Council of the US would need unanimity. Yes, that means every single state has to agree. So you can already imagine a state like Wyoming, with just 580,000 people, deciding, nope, we're not on board. And that would be it. No sanctions on Russia. The whole thing collapses. Which means in this US as the EU model, the entire country could be held hostage by a single state. And it doesn't stop there. If the US really worked like the EU, you'd end up with something wild. Imagine 50 separate armies, California proudly sailing around with its own aircraft carrier, Texas showing off with a few more just because it can, and maybe Vermont with a single submarine that doesn't quite work. Then you'd have 50 different immigration systems, all arguing about who counts as a resident or how long a visa should last. 50 sets of labor laws, So a worker could be fully protected in Oregon, but lose half their rights just by crossing into Idaho. And on top of that, 50 foreign policies, each trying to speak with one voice while saying completely different things. It would be chaos. Okay, so that bit of fun is now over. The whole US as the EU idea is a bit silly, isn't it? The EU isn't a country like the United States, so comparing the two directly doesn't really work. So what is the EU then? Technically, it's an intergovernmental organization, a group of independent countries that choose to cooperate. You could say it's closer to a confederal model, where most power stays with the member states, and the central authority, like the EU institutions, can only act if everyone agrees. There aren't really any confederations in the world today, but there were in the past, like the United States under the Articles of Confederation between 1781 and 1789. Back then, the central government had barely any power. Each state was basically independent, with Washington only handling big stuff like foreign policy or disputes between states. The US later became a federal system, which is very different. In a federation, power is shared between the central government and the states. Both can make laws, collect taxes, and run institutions. If you imagine a spectrum from centralized to decentralized, the US would sit somewhere in the middle. The EU, meanwhile, is way over on the decentralized side, where most decisions still happen nationally. A centralized system would be something like France or the UK, where big decisions come from Paris or London, and regions mostly carry them out. And one important thing to remember, federalism doesn't mean centralization. It's about sharing power between levels of government, not piling it all up at the top. This is what I think. The whole idea of this video was to show you how insanely complex the EU is. But does this mean that the EU needs to move towards a US model? No. There are plenty of things in the American system we shouldn't copy. But I do think that the EU should move further to the left towards a federation than that it is now. And there are 4 key areas where I think the EU really needs reform. First, the EU needs to end the veto power for individual member states. If a policy falls under the EU's authority, then the EU should be able to act without one country blocking everything for everyone else. Second, the EU needs a pan-European constituency. In most federations, citizens vote on both local and national levels. Right now, Europeans only vote for their national parties, which then form alliances in the European Parliament. But with a pan-European constituency, citizens could also vote for EU-wide parties, letting candidates represent the entire union, not just their home country. That would strengthen European democracy and give people a real sense of voting for something bigger than national politics. And third, the EU needs to directly elect the Commission president, or at the very least, formalize the Spitzenkandidaten process so it's actually enshrined in law, not just a polite suggestion that can be ignored whenever convenient. And fourth, we need to federalize when it comes to defense. Right now, we've got 27 small armies, each doing their own thing. It's expensive, inefficient, and frankly, not very intimidating. But one European army? That would actually look like real power. There are plenty of other reforms worth debating, but for me, these are the big ones. The ones that could actually make the EU work like a real political union, not just a very well-organized committee. We actually made an entire series about what kind of political model the EU could adopt in the future. Maybe something more like Switzerland, or maybe like Germany. And in the future, we might even look at how the Russian or Indian federal systems compare too. So subscribe if you want to stay updated on these topics. Thank you so much for watching. And thank you to our presidents, Jan Schauke, Christian Peter, AGVD, Daniel Unite Europe, Stefan, and Kiki Loxen. See you in the next video.